Bumpy Johnson felt the room tighten when the click sounded beneath the table, an insult wrapped as a threat. Everyone expecting blood, everyone forgetting the man who ruled Harlem without rushing. Bumpy Johnson sat with his hands folded, knuckles resting lightly against the edge of the table. The room smelled of cigars and damp wool coats. Men shifted in their chairs, pretending comfort, pretending patience. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. This was supposed to be business. Quiet business. Respectful business. Then the sound came. A sharp, metallic click beneath the table, small but unmistakable. It was the sound of intention. The sound of a man announcing violence without saying a word. Every breath in the room stalled at once. Eyes dropped. Shoulders tightened. Someone had brought death into the room and wanted it noticed. Bumpy did not look down. He did not flinch. He did not move his hands. His face stayed calm, almost distant, as if the sound belonged to another room entirely. He had heard clicks before, louder ones, faster ones. Some followed by screams, some followed by silence that lasted forever. This one was different. This one was meant for him. A test. A question asked in metal instead of language. The men around. The table waited for Bumpy to do what men were expected to do. They waited for anger, for shouting, for sudden movement. That was the rule everywhere else. But Harlem had different rules. And Bumpy Johnson had written most of them. He understood something they didn't. Violence rushed is weakness. Violence delayed is power. And power, real power, lives in the pause. Across from him, the man responsible for the sound sat frozen. His foot was still pressed forward, toe angled. Inward, as if he could rewind the moment by force of will. Sweat formed at his temples. He had planned this. He had imagined fear, maybe pleading. He had not imagined silence. Silence was heavier than any gun. Bumpy finally lifted his eyes, slow and deliberate. He looked around the table, not at the weapon. Not at the man, but at everyone else. He read their faces the way a preacher reads a congregation. He saw fear. He saw calculation. He saw relief that they were not the ones being tested. Harlem sat in those chairs with them, listening. He spoke softly, just enough to be heard. Not a threat, not a command, a reminder. The kind of reminder that carries history in its tone. The kind that doesn't need repetition. The words settled into the room and stayed there, pressing down harder than the click ever could. No one reached for anything. No one stood up. The gun remained hidden suddenly, embarrassed by its own presence. The man beneath the table realized too late that he had already lost. He had mistaken restraint for hesitation. He had confused patience with fear. In Harlem, that mistake could erase a life. Bumpy let the moment stretch. He allowed the weight of it to educate everyone present. This was how order was maintained, not through chaos, through clarity. Through making sure no one ever forgot who they were dealing with and what consequences arrived without warning when respect was abandoned. Outside, Harlem moved as it always did. Vendors shouted. Music drifted from open windows. Children ran. Between stoops, inside that room, something invisible shifted. A lesson was being carved into memory, not just for the man with the gun, but for everyone who would hear the story later. Bumpy rose slowly from his chair. The movement was unhurried, controlled. He adjusted his coat, straightened his cuffs. Small gestures, deliberate gestures. He did not look back at the man under the table as he turned toward the door. He didn't need to. The room already understood. What came next? The click had been an invitation to violence. Bumpy answered with certainty. That answer would travel farther than any bullet. It would be whispered in bars, repeated in back rooms, carried carefully across Harlem like a warning. Wrapped in respect. Men would remember that sound, but they would remember Bumpy's silence more. Silence that told them exactly where they stood. Silence that reminded them this city was not ruled by noise, but by men who understood when not to make it. The meeting ended without incident. Chairs scraped, coats were pulled on, hands were shaken. With forced steadiness, no one mentioned the gun. No one mentioned the click. But everyone carried it with them when they stepped back into the street. For Bumpy Johnson, it was just another moment where the world tried to rush him and failed. Another reminder that power didn't announce itself with noise. It waited, it listened, and when it spoke, the room broke. That day would not be marked by blood or bodies. It would be marked by memory, by the understanding that Harlem belonged to a man who did not need to reach under the table to prove it. The click was meant to end something. Instead, it exposed the truth. In that room, only one man controlled how violence entered Harlem and how it stayed out. Everyone else was just passing through his silence, whether they understood it yet or not. And that silence would follow them, long after. That night, before Bumpy Johnson ever sat at that table with a gun aimed at his chest, Harlem had already decided who he was. It wasn't a title he gave himself. It wasn't built in the papers. And it wasn't taken by force, not the kind that spills in alleys. His authority was grown in quieter soil, loyalty, memory, and a long ledger of debts he never called in. Not yet. On Lenox, men nodded when they saw him, not out of fear, but out of alignment. He walked without an entourage. He didn't need one. The block moved when he moved. Barber shops paused, shoeshine boys slowed their strokes. The street read his pace like scripture. Harlem didn't crown kings with votes. It crowned them with whispers, with stories told in kitchens and behind church walls. And in those stories, Bumpy was never loud, never the first to speak. He was the man who stayed standing when other men ran out of words. That's what made people believe. That's what made them trust him with more than their safety, with their dignity. Years back, when police raided the wrong door and dragged out a teenage boy in front of his mother, it wasn't a press release that followed. It was Bumpy, standing at her stoop before dawn, envelope in hand, quiet assurance in his eyes. No cameras, no crowd, just presence. That boy grew up knowing his name meant something. That woman lit a candle for him every week since. That was Harlem. And Harlem didn't forget. People talked about rackets, numbers, protection. The outsiders obsessed over that. But inside Harlem, people knew the real currency was consistency. Who showed up, who stayed, who disappeared when things got hard. Bumpy didn't disappear. He expanded. Even the pastors knew his name, and not in shame. More than once, rent for the chapel came from an envelope left in the pew. No sermon required. The Lord's work didn't always wear a collar. Sometimes it wore a three-piece suit and walked with its hands behind its back. His enemies misunderstood him because they misunderstood Harlem. They saw a flash, thought power came from shouting, from stomping, from drawing blood in daylight. But Harlem knew different. Harlem understood that when a man stays calm during chaos, it's not because he's afraid. It's because he already won something deeper. Something rooted. The old men on the corner remembered when Bumpy walked sugar Ray home from a club fight, not because he had to, but because a police cruiser had circled twice too slow. They remembered how the patrol car never slowed again. The women at the beauty shop remembered how he sent coats to the single mothers during the hard winters, how he never asked for thanks, how he nodded once through the glass and kept walking. This was legacy. This was weight. Even the children knew his rules passed down through parents without ever being written. Don't steal from your own. Don't lie in God's house. Don't raise your voice if your point is strong enough to stand on its own. And if someone ever puts a weapon under the table while Bumpy Johnson is sitting there, You leave the room before he decides to stand. They were younger men now, coming up fast. Too fast. Wearing silk before they earned cotton. Talking before they listened. But they were still in Harlem. And Harlem belonged to Bumpy, not in ink, not in ownership, but in breath, in rhythm, in structure, because every street corner he had helped clean, every mother he helped bury her boy with dignity, every cop he paid to back off when it mattered, that stayed. It lived in the bones of the block. You didn't challenge that with a single move. You didn't undo that kind of foundation with a click under a table. They called him the gentleman gangster, as if that softened him. But the ones who lived here knew the truth. The suits were armor. The words were sharpened steel. The calm was a boundary drawn in stone. He didn't speak unless it mattered. And when it did, God help you if you thought the silence beforehand meant weakness. Power didn't come from what he owned. It came from what he never had to explain, and in Harlem, explanations were cheap. So when word spread that a man had tried something reckless in a backroom meeting, people didn't panic. They didn't gossip. They waited. Because Harlem understood the rhythm: 1 step, 2 steps, silence, then a shift. That's how Bumpy always moved, not fast. But permanent power is rarely tested in public. The men who wanted Bumpy Johnson out didn't come crashing through Harlem's front doors. They didn't post up with guns on street corners or shout challenges in daylight. That's not how it's done when you're serious. No, they worked behind curtains, quietly, strategically, with the kind of pressure that doesn't make headlines but can collapse empires if unchecked. The first sign came with a delay. A shipment that normally moved smooth and silent from the docks arrived 3 days late. No explanation, no apology. The workers' men who usually tipped their hats when they saw Bumpy's lieutenants suddenly had their eyes fixed on the ground. That silence wasn't confusion. It was instruction. Next came the phone calls that didn't go through. A banker Bumpy had known 15 years suddenly wasn't taking messages. A union boss he'd once protected during a bitter strike declined a meeting twice. These weren't accidents. This was orchestration. Someone was cutting the lines that ran under Harlem, hoping Bumpy wouldn't notice until the foundation sagged beneath him. But Bumpy noticed. He always noticed. He didn't confront. He observed. He walked the block with fewer words. Sat in the back of the cafe longer than usual. When people approached, asking if he was concerned, he smiled once, the kind that told them not to ask again, because Bumpy understood something the men behind this pressure didn't. Harlem wasn't a business to be flipped. It wasn't turf to be won. It was a body, a living thing. And he had spent decades learning its heartbeat. They were trying to make him sweat. But the men pressing in had never seen Bumpy in the rain. They didn't know what he looked like when things got hard. They thought cutting off the easy paths would make him stumble. But all it did was slow him down. And slowing Bumpy down meant he saw more than they wanted him to. The third signal was more serious. An old friend, Clarence Keyes Langston, was picked up on an unrelated charge. A weapons rap from years ago, buried, supposed to be forgotten. But suddenly it was resurrected, pushed through the courts fast, like someone wanted him gone from the chessboard. Clarence wasn't a frontline player. He was a keeper of memory. A man who'd been with Bumpy back when they still walked into places through the back door because of the color of their skin. Now he was being used as leverage. Bumpy didn't respond. Didn't send lawyers. Didn't send muscle. He sent books. A quiet visit from a priest. A message to the judge that Harlem was watching. Clarence never spoke a word. He didn't have to. Loyalty, real loyalty, doesn't require reassurance. It only requires presence. And Bumpy made sure that presence was felt even behind bars. Meanwhile, the men behind the curtain moved faster. They saw no reaction and mistook it for indecision. They misunderstood again. They thought no movement meant no plan. That was the fatal mistake, because Bumpy had no intention of reacting. He intended to position, while the enemy moved loud in. The dark, Bumpy moved quiet in the light. He spoke to preachers, not politicians, sat with bartenders, not bosses. He reminded Harlem, without saying it, who had shown up during the 1938 food shortage. Who paid the widow's mortgage when the state wouldn't? Who stepped between the people and the chaos when other men profited from disorder? They weren't just attacking Bumpy Johnson. They were insulting the structure that Harlem had chosen. To trust and Harlem felt it. You could see it in the way people stared a little longer when new cars rolled into the neighborhood. You could feel it in how the corner boys went quiet when a stranger walked too slow. You could hear it in the drums on Sunday evening that thumped like a warning before a storm. Then came the envelope. No return name. Just dropped off at the back door of his preferred barber shop. Inside, a photo of Bumpy's daughter walking to school, folded once. Creased through the middle. Not a threat, not directly. Just a suggestion. A whisper of what could be. That was the moment the enemy went to. Far. Not because Bumpy panicked, but because he now had clarity. See, there's a line. A deep one. Between business and insult. Between pressure and poison, they had crossed it. And they had done it in the dumbest way possible. By underestimating what Harlem meant to Bumpy, and what Bumpy meant to Harlem. He didn't yell. Didn't roar. Didn't pull anyone into a dark alley. That would be noise. What he did was simpler. He went home. Sat on the porch of a retired jazz player who used to perform with Duke Ellington. Drank bitter tea. Listened to rain. And made 5 phone calls, each one under 2 minutes. Each one to men who didn't live in Harlem anymore, but never stopped answering his call. The next morning, 3 trucks were redirected at the docks. A private banker reopened a line of credit, due to clerical error. The judge overseeing Clarence's case delayed the trial without reason, and the man who had folded that photo? He found a note inside his coat pocket. It read, "You're in the wrong story." That's how Bumpy worked, not through spectacle. Through return to balance, return to order, return to the truth that power, real power, is not about how many moves you make. It's about knowing when not to move at all. You don't slap a man like Bumpy Johnson in private and expect it to stay. Harlem talks. But Harlem talks in its own way, not with screaming headlines or flashing lights. It talks through rhythm, through repetition, through the way a story bends as it passes from barbershop to kitchen, from church bench to street corner. And when the story made its way through the neighborhood, that someone had brought a hidden gun to a sit-down with Bumpy, it wasn't the click that echoed loudest. It was the silence that followed. The silence Bumpy gave it. That silence became prophecy. It was a small-time mover named Littles who said it first. A man tried that and he's still breathin'? Something's coming. And something was, not because Bumpy raised his voice, but because Harlem did it for him. The corner boys were first. Word reached them through whispers layered over dice games and smoke. They started treating outsiders with longer looks, watching who walked where and who walked how. Strangers started getting questions. Not threats, just questions. But in Harlem, questions asked by the wrong person at the wrong time could freeze blood. At Sylvia's, the waitresses who'd served Bumpy 1,000 times passed glances between each other when the wrong men came in. Food got cold before it reached their table. No one rushed. Because Harlem doesn't feed disrespect quickly. In the churches, there were sermons not about crime, not about Bumpy by name, but about order. About what happens when men forget what was built, and who protected it. The devil does not always carry a pitchfork. One preacher said, Sometimes he carries a smile and walks like he belongs here." Old women murmured and nodded. They knew what it meant. They knew who was being reminded. They knew who the words were for. That's how Harlem works. It protects itself. And it protects those who protect it. The public disrespect hadn't drawn blood, but it had drawn judgment. And now the city was watching not for what Bumpy would do, but for when. That made it worse for the ones who tried him. Because now, every hour they remained unpunished, they were being studied. Watched, measured. And when Harlem watches you with patience, you're already losing. The man who brought the gun, the one whose leg trembled after the click, he began to feel it. Not from Bumpy directly, but from the way nobody sat next to him anymore at his usual bar. From how his calls went unanswered. From how the girl he kept on and off suddenly wouldn't come near his place. She said her mother told her it's bad luck to sit with a man waiting to disappear. She wasn't wrong. And yet Bumpy still hadn't spoken. That was the real weight of the moment. That was the language people feared most. Not bullets. Not beatings. Silence. Silence from a man who had once cleared a block without lifting a finger. Just by standing on the corner with a look in his eyes. The disrespect didn't just sit with Bumpy. It touched every man who had ever sat at that table with him. It touched every deal that had been honored with a handshake instead of a contract. It touched the memory of every man who built something under his shadow and believed it meant something. And it forced them to ask themselves one question. If Bumpy could be disrespected and not answer, what did that mean for them? The more time passed, the louder the city got, but Bumpy remained still. Not out of weakness, out of mastery. Because the longer he stayed quiet, the more Harlem interpreted his silence as control. And the more his enemies misread it as delay. That gap between what people thought would happen and what Bumpy was actually doing. That was his weapon. That was how you break a room without touching anyone inside it. He wasn't waiting to explode. He was letting the city tighten the noose for him, one block at a time. The room was different this time. Same table, same chairs, same yellow light dripping down from the overhead fixture like a slow confession. But the air was thicker, quieter. Even the walls seemed to lean in. Everyone present understood. This was not a meeting. This was judgment. Bumpy Johnson entered without announcement. No coat over his arm, no notes in hand. Just a smooth step, and the kind of stillness that made other men nervous. He didn't speak right away, didn't even sit, just looked. The man who had brought the gun last time was already seated, alone, no muscle beside him. He had shaved, clean suit, trying to look like an order. But the fear was in the fingers, tapping once, then stopping, then trying not to move at all. Bumpy took his seat slowly. He didn't face the man directly. He faced the room, as if speaking to the wood, to the air, to Harlem itself. "I was told," he said, voice even, "that we were men who understood boundaries." No one answered. No one needed to. He wasn't asking. "I let time pass," he continued, "because some lessons need space to settle." The man across the table opened his mouth to speak. A breath. A twitch of apology. Bumpy raised one hand, not in anger, not in warning. Just enough to stop the air itself. "You already spoke," he said. "When you brought steel, we're there." Should have been words. And now came the silence, not absence. Authority. Bumpy didn't threaten. He didn't point. He didn't need to, because every man in that room knew the truth. Bumpy wasn't here to punish. He was here to define, to set a line so deep into the floor that no one would dare scratch it again. He leaned forward. Not aggressive, intimate. "This place," he said softly, "this city, I don't hold it by force. I hold it because I understand what it costs to lose it. And there it was, not a warning. A reckoning. The man across from him, once cocky, now cracking, shifted in his chair. His palms were damp, his tie loose. He realized then he hadn't brought a gun into a meeting. He had brought cowardice into a covenant. That was the real insult. The room held its breath as Bumpy stood. His voice, one final time, "Harlem isn't a crown, it's a mirror. And it reflects what you are when no one's clapping." Then he turned, walked out. No retaliation. Nobody left behind, but the damage was total. The man was already broken, and worse, everyone knew it. Harlem would never forget who sat across from Bumpy and didn't leave a mark. That silence? It would follow him forever. Bumpy didn't need to destroy him. Harlem had already done that. The story didn't end with a gun. It ended with a whisper. A man walked into a meeting thinking he could rattle Bumpy Johnson. He left untouched, but uninvited, unwelcome, and undone. And Harlem remembered. Not the click, not the insult, but the response. The absence of rage. The way Bumpy let the silence speak in every hallway, every corner, every barbershop that passed the story along without needing names. Harlem told it its own way. He didn't blink, didn't raise a hand, didn't have to. There were no headlines, no blood on the sidewalk, but a boundary had been redrawn. Not just around Bumpy, but around Harlem itself. The message was clear. Power here is not something you seize. It's something that's given to you slowly, carefully, and can be taken back without a sound. The man who tried him vanished from relevance. Deals stopped, faces turned. Even men who owed him didn't call him back. Not because they feared Bumpy's revenge, but because they feared being on the wrong side of Harlem's memory. That's the part outsiders never understand. In Harlem, legacy doesn't live in marble. It lives in the choices a man makes when no one's watching, and in how many people remember those choices after he's gone. Bumpy didn't just lead. He belonged to the churches that prayed for peace, to the corners that watched for their own, to the mothers who knew their sons were safer because he walked the block. He never asked Harlem to love him, but it did, because he never forced Harlem to follow him. But it did. Because in the end, when the threat came quiet and dressed in pride, Bumpy stayed calmer than anyone expected and stronger than anyone deserved. And that's the part Harlem tells, even now. Not that he won, but how.